Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Everything F1 podcast. My name is Sean, and in this new series of specials, we'll be sharing some of our best interviews from our archives with the very best and most interesting guests we've ever featured on the show over the past 5 years. This week's classic episode features Mark Gallagher, one of F1's leading journalists and racing executives. Having worked with the likes of Jordan F1, Red Bull Racing, Cosworth, and many, many more, he is even a champion team leader in his own right. In this incredible interview, Mark told us all about his fantastic career in F1, including some amazing stories about the likes of Eddie Jordan, Michael Schumacher, and even a very enjoyable anecdote about the great Bernie Ecclestone. If you enjoy this type of content, please let us know by leaving a like and hitting subscribe. And don't forget, we're still running our giveaway of a Lego F1 set of your choice once we hit 500 subscribers. So hit subscribe, enjoy this episode. We'll see you next week again for the Miami Grand Prix. Enjoy.
I think this is a perfect opportunity then to segue into our interview with our esteemed guest, Mark Gallagher. We've got loads of questions. Hopefully we won't keep you too long, but hopefully,
That's fine.
You'll keep us entertained with your anecdotes and stories from the years gone by. So first of all, let's talk about before you got into the career, the F1 career. Yep. So was it always Formula One that you were striving for? Or did you were you a 9-year-old boy watching TV and listening to Murray Walker's tones on the TV and that's it?
The thing is, tragically, when I was 9 years old, Murray Walker wasn't even the Formula One commentator yet. It was a guy called Raymond Baxter who covered Formula One for the BBC. But interestingly, the very first Formula One race that I remember watching, and I know I watched others, but the one that I absolutely remember watching was the 1973 British Grand Prix at Silverstone on TV. And I was a big Jackie Stewart fan. I still am, and I've been lucky to meet him and work with him. And but Jackie Stewart really captured my imagination in his Tyrrell, and then Emerson Fittipaldi in his John Pear Special Lotus, and all of that generation that really captured my imagination. And growing up in Ireland, Sean, I'm sure the same applies to you. It's difficult to grow up in Ireland and not fall in love with tarmac rallying. And I loved rallies, and I used to go to all of the big rallies in Ireland when I was a teenager. I had a brother, and my brother has a brother-in-law who was a very accomplished rally driver, and we used to go with their service crew to some of the big rallies in Ireland at the time, and it was terrific. But to be honest with you, I did really start to focus on Formula One as I got into my late teens, went to university. And when I came into university, I landed a job at Autosport, and I won't bore you with how that managed to happen, but they had a job going. And I mean, I can't believe that I applied for it. And well, I can believe I applied for it, but I can't believe I got it. I got this job working for Autosport when I was 21.
Wow.
And what was great about working in the media was that you get to know everyone, because the moment you've got that press credential, you can go in the paddock, you can introduce yourself to people, and so that was really, Formula One did become the focus for me. And actually, when James, when you ask the question, was it always Formula One? I did go through phases where my interest drifted, and I've liked other categories, or I even worked in the World Rally Championship briefly, and I really loved that. Worked with Colin McRae for a while, but actually, the older I've become, the more I've actually re-fallen in love with my first love, Formula One, and I think it is just an unutterably brilliant sport. I love every facet. And I'm not one of those people who says it was much better in the old days. It was just different. The old days had a lot of good things about them, but the old days also had a lot of bad things about them. It was a lot less professional. People lost their lives all the time. When I started working in Formula One, I kept meeting drivers who were in wheelchairs as a result of catastrophic accidents and things like that. So when I look at the sport today, I just think it's stunning. And I hope that with someone like Stefano Domenicali as chief executive, and he is absolutely a Formula One fan through and through, passionate guy about the sport. I think the sport's in good hands. And so, yeah, it's Formula One. And when I look back in my life, it's unquestionably going to be one thing that's the thread that runs the whole way through it.
What I would like to talk about, and it's something that I'm sure I think you mentioned in our email correspondence, Mark. This weekend was the 30th anniversary of one Michael Schumacher joining the sport. You obviously you worked with Michael. So can you kind of give us kind of your take on his debut and how massive it was for him at the time?
Yeah, it's looking back on it, it's terrific to have been there with him on the occasion of his debut. Did we think that he would waltz under the distance and win 91 Grand Prix and 7 World Championships? Probably not. But to be honest with you, we did think he was pretty damn good, because we put him in the car for the first time ever. First time he was ever in a Formula One car was on Tuesday, the 20th of August, 1991 at Silverstone South Circuit. I was there with him. I went over to the track with him. He got in the car. He'd never driven an F1 car before. And, this is a very long time ago now, 30 years ago. The car had a clutch, manual clutch, and it had a H-pattern gearbox. And therefore, there was a lot more literally manual work to do to drive a Formula One car back then. And I remember him going out onto the track and us being really lecturing him about the importance of not over revving the engine, because the Ford Cosworth HB V8 was an easy engine to over rev if you got a gear shift wrong. And every time we over revved the engine, Cosworth would immediately replace the engine, and we would get a bill for £30,000. And I can promise you that by August 1991, Eddie did not have £30,000 left to give Cosworth for another engine rebuild. So, he went out onto the track, and he was amazing. He was very quick. I'll tell you one story about that first test. So the very first time he came past us to finish up, to go on to a flying lap. So it was the end of his out lap. He arrived at the chicane right beside the pit. The South Circuit had a little pit area with a chicane by it. And he arrived at the chicane so fast that he caught himself out. He actually missed the braking point. And he threw the car into the chicane, and he looked more like Colin McRae than Ayrton Senna at that point. And the car went completely sideways, but he caught the slide and he absolutely floored it. He just flattened the throttle and did this power slide through the chicane on opposite lock. And that's on his first lap in a Formula One car, And I was standing beside Trevor Foster, who was his race engineer at the time. And I just remember Trevor looking at me like, oh dear, what have we got here? And then he headed out onto the straight that's down onto the Hanger Straight down to Stowe Corner. And you could hear him going up through the gears, and you could tell that he was catching the gear shifts at exactly the right point. So it became very clear very quickly that here was a young guy who was going to wring the neck of our car. And I've actually written a feature in Grand Prix Racing Magazine this month about our weekend. And one of the things that I did for that feature was I actually went and caught up with Trevor, and we had a coffee a couple of weeks ago at Silverstone and I talked about what it was like to be Michael's race engineer for the first weekend. And Trevor told a really cool story, which was about the fact that Michael qualified 7th, of course, and Andrea de Cesaris was 11th on the grid. The margin of difference was half a second. Wow. So that's a chunky amount of time, half a second a lap quicker than Andrea de Cesaris. And actually, he was faster than that, because if he had completed his fastest lap, he would have qualified 5th. And the only reason he didn't complete that lap was that another car spun in front of him towards the end of the lap. But he was heading to be the fifth fastest and qualify 5th on the grid.
That's crazy.
And in the debrief afterwards, Trevor and Gary Anderson were sitting there with Michael and Andrea de Cesaris, and they said to Michael, basically, how did you do that? And he said, I realized that the best way to carry speed in the car was not to was not to change down gear. So he said, coming through some of the fast curves on Spa, he said, instead of changing down gear, I would just rest my foot on the brake pedal, but I'd keep my foot flat on the throttle. So here's a guy in his first Grand Prix weekend in 1991 using left foot braking to keep the speed in the car. And he said, I realized that by doing that, the diffuser would continue to work really well and would keep the downforce intact.
Wow.
When they then turned to Andrea de Cesaris admitted that for the same corner, he was changing down gear. And he said, there's a big bump in the middle and we need to change the springs and we need to change the ride height. We need to change this, need to change that. And Michael's just gone, no, flat. Just keep it, take it flat. So, Trevor and I, when we were talking about what had happened that weekend, we did reflect on the fact that if Michael had not left us and gone to Benetton, what he might have achieved in that car over the balance of the season, if he was half a second a lap quicker than Andrea de Cesaris, it is mind-blowing to consider what he might have achieved over the rest of the season in the Jordan 191. But it was an extraordinary experience, and I now look back on it as a great privilege to have been in there on ground zero of the Michael Schumacher career, and then to witness him go on and achieve what he did. And I remain a big fan of his, even though I know there are lots of people out there who feel he overstepped the mark on a few occasions, but he was an awesome racing driver and a very good human being.
What was your first role with Autosport then? That was how you were introduced to Formula One professionally, yeah? So
yeah,
I was just did you get to interview some of your idols? Did you get to interview Jackie Stewart that early in your career?
No, I didn't. I mean, the thing is, so the job that I applied for on Autosport was in advertising and marketing. I wasn't even writing for the magazine. Oh, okay. But I just used that as a Trojan horse. Literally, I took one job with the idea of doing another job once I got there. And so I started writing for the magazine, and the editor started saying, okay, fine, you can go and cover a Formula Ford race this weekend. And then I went freelance. And I went freelance in 1986, and I started covering Formula 3000, which was effectively F2, and Formula One. I started covering Formula One on a freelance basis. I was making no money, and I had no money. But I mean, I drove to all Europe, and if I could afford the flight to Japan or somewhere, I would go to the race, and I began to build a big network. My big turning point was discovering that I had an aptitude for interviewing people on stage, and that I was quite good at hosting events. Okay. And I started working with Marlboro and with Canon, and I got a contract with Marlboro for 5 years, and I got a contract with Canon, and I found myself on stage interviewing Alain Prost or Nigel Mansell or Riccardo Patrese or Ayrton Senna, and and that wasn't on the media. That was working with sponsors on a freelance basis, effectively helping with the events that they were putting on. So I was a journalist, but I was already working on the commercial side with sponsors. And I just loved that. And I really fell in love with the commercial side. But as soon as I got to meet these drivers, and of course, back then I was in my mid-20s, and the drivers were generally a bit older in those days. So they were generally all in their kind of mid-30s. So there was a little bit of a generation gap. So I really looked up to them, and I found that really terrific. And then, of course, EJ, who I got to know, we had a number of touch points. I was a very good close friend of Martin Donnelly, who grew up in Belfast with me, and he ended up driving for Eddie in Formula 3000, and obviously got his breakthrough into Formula One driving for Lotus in 1990. So there were lots of touch points between me and Eddie. And then obviously he told me he was going to do F1, and I helped him. I wrote the first press release announcing the creation of Jordan Grand Prix, and then I was press officer for the team in the first season in 1991. So I then really began to leave the journalism behind, and I just focused on working for the teams. And I really enjoyed that. And I found working on the commercial side of the sport extremely rewarding, albeit the drivers don't really like the commercial side of the teams, because that's just like, that's a time waster for them, So I spent quite a few years trying to, begging drivers to come and see sponsors and saying, could you please do another PR event, or could you come and talk to this chief executive who has just given us a few million quid to sponsor you and pay your salary. But it was great. It was a great privilege, and obviously met and worked with a lot of really good talents at Jordan, and that was it, really.
Jordan will be something quite close to my heart. When I was getting into Formula One in the late 90s, to drop me, it was around about the time that Jordan won in Spa, and being from the part of the island that I'm from, any sort of connection to Formula One is very rare. Like I had, I think, one friend growing up who was a Formula One fan. It's only now, like I said, with Drive to Survive, that there's more Formula One fans. So I was always kind of an outlier in being a Formula One fan, and it was great to know that there was some connection to our tiny little island. Obviously, Eddie Irvine, to a certain extent, he's from down as well. But what I'd love to know is kind of, obviously you knew the team very, very well from the start, but kind of a two-part question is, one, what was Eddie like? Like, how did Eddie, or if he did, change from when the team started to the later days when he sold to Jaguar, wasn't it? And like, what was he like day to day? And then the second part is, what do you think of kind of what's become of his team now, with it being Aston Martin, after the Racing Point days and Force India?
Yeah. I mean, Eddie, I should actually just tell you, Sean, that Eddie Irvine was my lodger. So that's another podcast that we could do. And
at home with Mark and Eddie.
I wish I had some of the audio recordings of the goings on that used to happen in our house when Eddie was there, but it would have to be shown after the watershed.
Would we be able to broadcast that?
Yeah, exactly. It would have to be after the watershed. But anyway, but it's interesting, Sean, what you're saying there, because actually Formula One became very big in Ireland because it was being broadcast on terrestrial television on RTE, and you had an Irish team and you had an Irish driver in Eddie Irvine, and I mean, like myself, obviously from Northern Ireland, but I mean, I can promise you that once we all ended up in the paddock, Ireland was a very united place. It was, it didn't matter whether it was Gary Anderson from Coleraine or Eddie Jordan from Dublin or me from Belfast or wherever we all came from, and we had a great time. But Eddie was Eddie put absolutely everything on the line to make that team happen. I mean, if you take the biggest risk you've ever taken in your career, and that's what Eddie did every day for several years. And he could have lost everything. He could have lost his home. He could have lost all his money. He could have been bankrupt. And I mean, at the time he put Michael Schumacher in the car in Spa 91, I can tell you we had pretty serious debts by that time. And none of it was amusing. None of it. I mean, everyone laughs about it. But it's so easy to laugh about it, 30 years later. At the time, it was deadly serious. And Eddie and Ian Phillips, who was the commercial boss of the team at the time, I mean, they used to tell me about the day they sat in the Silverstone Cafe and looked at each other and realized the team would have to close in 2 weeks because there was just no money left. And that's how close it got. They couldn't pay the VAT bill. They couldn't pay suppliers. They were in serious trouble. And that takes a huge amount of courage to do that. And so what changed about Eddie was that he took that huge motivation that he had to be successful and he put everything on the line to create that team. And there's no taking it away from him that he got the payback, because ultimately the team did make him a very wealthy guy, because he, first of all, the team became very profitable. It was a very successful team from a financial perspective. He was able to pay himself obviously good salary, and had a very nice lifestyle off the back of it. And he did sell the team, and it didn't go to Jaguar. He sold it to Midland, and then of course it went to Spiker, and then I went from Spiker to Force India and now Aston Martin. And I remember talking to Eddie on one occasion when he was feeling a little bit aggrieved. He was a little bit down about the fact that he was no longer involved. Mm-hmm. And I remember saying to him, Eddie, don't worry about it, because in the fullness of time, the only thing people will remember is that you set up a Formula One team, that you ran it for 15 years, that you won some Grand Prix, that you made a lot of money, and that the team is still surviving, which is more than can be said for Alain Prost's team or the Arrows team, or there's lots of other teams just disappeared. Jordan continued, and to see the team today as Aston Martin F1 is just it's just fabulous. And when you consider that Andy Stevenson, the sporting director, and that Andy Green, the chief technical officer, were with Jordan way back in '91, it's a marvelous story. There are lots of people in that team who've been there the whole way through. So I think Eddie's legacy is actually extraordinary, and he deserves more credit. People kind of talk about Eddie as a bit of a joker and all the rest of it. I mean, he was a very successful team owner. And yes, he's something of a maverick, but that's one of the reasons that he was successful. On a day-to-day basis, he was he could be a very demanding boss. He was relentless. Every morning, I would get the phone call, come and see me in my office. I'd go upstairs and we'd sit down and talk about forthcoming attractions, be it sending proposals to sponsors or PR events or whatever was happening. And he was constantly on the case. I mean, he was absolutely driven to get the next deal done, to get in the next money, to win the next sponsorship contract. I mean, he was just completely focused on that. And he could be a tough task master, but on the other side, he looked after me very well. And I certainly, for quite a long period of time, really, really enjoyed working for him. It became less fun as the team became much larger. And then we certainly noticed that after he sold a big chunk of the team to a private equity company in November '98, we started to notice the change. And that wasn't so much a change in Eddie as a change in the culture of the team, because all of a sudden we had a much larger board of directors. We had some financial people in there. They started to experiment with growing the team and diversifying it in lots of different ways. You guys are probably too young to remember that we launched a Jordan drink called EJ10, and I remember a guy standing up in the boardroom one day and telling us that we wouldn't need any sponsors in the future because the Jordan drink was going to make so much money that the team would be completely self-funding. And I remember
EJ gives you wings, does it?
Well, it was EJ gives you wings. But the sad thing about that, and I mean, you guys are laughing, Ian Phillips and I were laughing about it, but actually it felt tragic because it was so clearly, sorry to use the language, but it was so clearly bullshit. It was never going to happen. And sure enough, it didn't happen. But what it did do was it distracted the team. It distracted the leadership. And so as the distraction grew larger, the team's results began to diminish. And Trevor Foster, who I mentioned earlier on, who was Michael's race engineer in that first season and team manager, I remember Trevor saying to me, in 2000, 2001, he said, this team is in sharp decline. And so it proved. And that was difficult to witness because we lost our mojo. And it wasn't because Eddie or me or Gary Anderson, well, Gary had left the team by that stage, but it wasn't because of individuals so much as just the culture of the organization changed because it had become a little bit too big, and so we lost that kind of family magic that had been pretty special in the early days. But it didn't go belly up. It was sold, and it's still there today. And there's still a little chunk of me that watches Formula One every weekend and hopes that Sebastian Vettel, nicks another few wins driving for Aston Martin. And one final thing I'll tell you is that way back in 1999, so 22 years ago, Eddie and I did a sponsorship proposal to Lawrence Stroll and to actually sponsor Jordan. And in fact, part of that sponsorship discussion, Eddie was actually quite interested to get Lawrence Stroll involved as an owner of the team 22 years ago. Well, it didn't happen then. So it's really interesting to see that it's happened now and that Lawrence is in full control. And, we're very lucky in Formula One to have people like Lawrence Stroll. The old billionaire never does Formula One any harm.
No, absolutely. Well, the Jordan team and obviously its successors, Force India, and they've always been a team that kind of have boxed above their weight, haven't they? They've always performed really well. They've been a great mid-level team that's always been there, kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, James, there's a core group of people within that team who've always known how to fundamentally do a decent job. And when you have people like Andy Green, he's 30 years of experience of designing and manufacturing Formula One cars. So he's not going to wake up one day and suddenly do a rubbish job. He knows how to do it. And I think the other thing is that we always punched above our weight, because if McLaren had $10 to spend on something, we always had $3 to spend on the same thing. So the $3 has to be spent properly. So McLaren can spend $10 and waste 5 of them.
Yeah.
We have to make all 3 of our dollars count. So it was always about being efficient, spending money in the right way, not spending money on upgrades that don't work, if at all possible, and just keeping things simple. And I think perhaps my only, it's not a huge concern just yet, but an observation I would make since the Aston Martin takeover is they've recruited quite a lot of people. There's a danger the team loses what I just mentioned, that it starts to, in its rush to become a big team, it loses that agility that a smaller team holds. And I think somewhere between the size of Haas and the size of Mercedes-Benz, there is a happy medium. And I suspect that's probably where Jos Capito is going to, and Zach Brown are ending up with McLaren and Williams, where you employ, I don't know, you employ 600 or 700 people instead of 1,000 people. And that's still a massive organization, but it's somehow, I think Aston just need to not forget what they already know about how to punch above their weight and to know how to do that giant killing act. Because if they try to become a Ferrari, well, they really shouldn't become a Ferrari, because Ferrari hasn't actually been very good for quite a while. So they've got to be careful. You've got to be careful what you wish for.
Let's go over to Coops. Coops must have a question for Mark. What are you going to ask Mark today?
Well, it's down back to probably looking over your whole career. I'm just curious, you've worked with the likes of Jacques Villeneuve, Mika Hakkinen, Coulthard, Michael Schumacher we've touched on. Who was your favourite, or what stood out when you met all these different drivers throughout the years in terms of how they drove and what they were like?
It's a good question, Coops, because the reality is that I met them all at different stages. I met Mika Hakkinen when he was 18 years of age, racing in Vauxhall Lotus, and actually I met David Coulthard about that time as well. So I knew them in junior formula. I met Michael when he first drove the Jordan F1 car. I actually didn't really get to know Jacques until he was driving for BAR, and I was at Jordan. We had Honda engines. They had Honda engines. We ended up doing a few events together. So what I will tell you, what I would say is that what they all have in common is a single-minded determination to get to where they're going to get to, and they really, each one of them has had a sort of a laser focus on getting to Formula One, and in that respect, they've all been impressive because they've just done what they had to get there. However, the other thing that stands out is the degree to which each of them has had people help them at key points during their career. So they haven't done it all on their own, but their single-mindedness has impressed people to help them. So Michael benefited from Willy Weber's support. Willy, of course, owned the Formula 3 team that Michael drove for. David Coulthard had support from a couple of very good sponsors from his family. He had a couple of managers who helped him at different points in his career. Jacques Villeneuve, of course, had Craig Pollock managing him, helped him to secure big sponsorship to do IndyCar and then make the transition across to Formula One with Williams. So they've all been very single-minded, but they've also had good people around them. At least for a period of time, they've had a really quite a powerful package of people around them. In terms of the guys in terms of what do I think of them all, they're actually all quite different because, we all have different personalities and all of these drivers are quite different. There's no doubt that you wouldn't want to play poker with any of them. They have a steely determination, and it's a real, and it is made of steel. There's a very, very hard center to the degree of focus that they bring to their job, and you only have to spend a short amount of time with Jacques or with Mika or with DC, even now when they're long retired, and get them to talk about a particular race or a particular overtake or a particular pole position, or if you get DC to talk about what it's like to qualify and pole around Monte Carlo, he goes into another zone and he can describe the lap. He can describe where he's placing the wheel. He can describe where the front wing's being placed. He's going through it all in detail. Damon Hill, one of the most impressive people that I've worked with, because I didn't rate Damon that highly when he was in Formula 3 because he was teammate to Martin Donnelly. He was a good friend of mine, as I said earlier, and Martin was a bit quicker than Damon in Formula 3. And I wasn't sure about Damon, but then he got to Formula One with Brabham. And then I began to realize that here was a guy that was prepared to do anything that he could. And he drove a couple of really dreadful cars in lower formula just to keep his career going. And then he got that drive at Williams. And then the unthinkable happened. He became test driver. Alain Prost retires and Ayrton Senna loses his life. And suddenly Damon Hill finds himself not only with the race seat, but actually leading the team. And then he goes and wins a world championship, and he wins the world championship against Michael Schumacher. And by the way, Damon should really have won 2 world championships because Michael did take him out at Adelaide in 1994. So the reality, and I got to realize that Damon had this phenomenal focus that he brought. I mean, actually borderline anger. It was a kind of a manifest. He was angry to get the results, and he just channeled that. So they've all been really impressive in their own way. And again, probably because I'm getting older and passage of time, I respect all of them. I think they're all amazing, and what they, all particularly these guys we've just mentioned. And if you take someone like Jacques, who gets a lot of negative coverage on social media because he comes out with some outlandish things, and he likes being contrary. Yeah. But the thing to understand about Jacques is that Jacques is contrary because he loves being contrary. So if you expect Jacques Villeneuve to say white, he's going to say black. Yeah, because actually he wants to see a reaction. And what I will tell you is that he's a super guy to work with. And if you get, I did an event with Jacques recently online. We did a Zoom event with a client in Canada, and I got Jacques to talk about turning up at his first race, his first Formula One race in Melbourne, and sticking the car in pole position and finishing second. And we forget that. People forget that. I mean, it was astonishing what he did. And then he talked about winning the world championship. And then, of course, his whole career went pear-shaped because he decided, on the advice of his manager, to set up a Formula One team called BAR. And, things went downhill. But the fact is that Jacques has had an extraordinary career. And that's before you even get him to talk about his dad. And then when you get him to talk about Gilles Villeneuve, then you have another chapter of the Jacques Villeneuve story. And his kind of, the thing that I just love is that on the 25th anniversary of Gilles Villeneuve losing his life, Ferrari phoned Jacques and asked Jacques if he would like to come to Fiorano and drive his dad's car.
Oh, wow.
And he turned up in Fiorano. I mean, and Jacques had no relationship with Ferrari, never driven for Ferrari, obviously. Quite the opposite, they'd been competitors. But he turned up in Fiorano, and not only did they have his dad's car there, but it had the actual steering wheel that his dad had used. And then one of the mechanics came over with, I can't remember if it was the gloves or the seat. It might have been the seat that his dad had used. And Jacques then went and drove round Fano in Gilles' car. And I can tell you that when he shares that story, there's no arrogance, there's no hubris. He's telling it with humility and with passion and with a degree of emotion, because he realized, the circle of life that there has been in the Villeneuve family. So I look at all of these guys and I admire what they've achieved, and every single one of them contributes to the story of Formula One.
About Bernie Ecclestone, I wanted to speak to you about him. You must have had run-ins with him in the years, either from a journalistic perspective.
Jesus, you don't have run-ins with Bernie. If you have a run-in with Bernie, you don't survive it. So I'm still here. I would love to tell you that I negotiated against him and got one over on him, and that never. I used to sit in his office and say, "Yes, Mr. Ecclestone, whatever you would like, please. Yes, no problem." But he was, he's an extraordinary guy, and he did an amazing job.
He was a formidable character. Well, he is still a formidable character, just not necessarily on the grid anymore. It's still obviously.
I mean, the guy's a legend, and although he stayed on too long, he arguably should have stopped about 10 years, earlier. He loved what he did, and he was given a job by CVC Capital of staying on as chief executive. But I'll tell you a slightly horrifying story about Bernie, and it actually happened in 1991 when I was at Jordan. I was at the Brazilian Grand Prix, and I got a letter. An envelope appeared on my desk, and it said, when I opened it, it said, "You're invited to dinner with Mr. Ecclestone." And I thought, oh, Bernie's having a press dinner tonight, so I'll go along to that. There'll be 300 people there, and he's going to give a speech and whatever. So anyway, I went along to this restaurant, and I came in and I said, I'm here for the Ecclestone function. And they said, oh, right, follow us here. And they came in, and there was a table for 4.
Oh. And
there were 2 other journalists. There was Anne Giantini from L'Equipe in France, and there was Gerhard Kunschink from Salzburg, Nachrichten in Austria. And the 3 of us sat down, and there was one other chair. And we're looking at each other going, did you get an envelope inviting you to dinner with Bernie? Yeah. Anyway, he walks in, and he sits down, and he says, well, so glad you were all able to join me. And we're like, our mouths are on the table. We're like, what the hell is going on, And he says, the thing is, all 3 of you have written a story about me in the last 6 months, which I find very interesting, because you don't actually know me. And I don't really know how you can write about me when you haven't actually bothered to pick the phone up and have a chat. So I thought we'd have dinner, and then you can ask me anything you want. And then that way, the next time you write about me, you can write about me from a position of knowledge rather than ignorance. And It was like, it was the nicest bollocking I've ever had. And then he was like, and then the next thing he said was devastating, because he said, you can ask me any question you want over the next, he said, actually, there's no time limit, 4 hours, 5 hours. He said, you can ask me any question you want, but you can never write about it until I die. Okay. Ooh. And we were like, okay. So the thing is, in 1991, we all figured, he'll be gone in 15 years. and we're still waiting, and actually there's a pretty good chance he might outlive all of us because he's got so much money. He's got a cryogenic chamber somewhere in Geneva or somewhere that's going to keep him going. But anyway, we had a fabulous evening, and he was highly entertaining, very amusing, and quite a legend.
You've been afforded all these experiences in your lifetime because of Formula One. You've worked for Jordan, you've worked for obviously the teams that led up to Red Bull, and you've done the cars. You've consulted on Hollywood films. You're like a superstar down the grid. So, were there any people that you were kind of intimidated yourself by on the grid, or were you always kind of like the person to talk to down there, kind of always calm?
So was I ever intimidated by?
Yeah,
people?
were you ever intimidated by any of the people you interviewed, or any of the people
God,
you met?
Yeah. God, I was intimidated by them all. I mean, there's. Have any of you ever watched Team America?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so there's three types of people.
Yes.
Do you know that line?
Okay. It's been a few years, but I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So anyway, so that's Formula One. So they're all quite intimidating. There's lots of interesting characters. And it's interesting when I look back, certainly on some of these amazing people that you come into contact with. Very briefly, we'll just tell you that when I was at Cosworth, we were supplying engines to Williams, and we actually had an opportunity to supply engines to Red Bull, because even back in 2010, Red Bull's relationship with Renault was not particularly fantastic, and Adrian Newey was very keen on having an engine partner that he felt more comfortable working with, and we were very keen to work with Red Bull. So we got that conversation going, and as I say, we were supplying engines to Williams. So I had a phone call one day in my office, and it was Frank Williams' secretary, and she said, Mr. Gallagher, Frank, we'd like to have a meeting with you. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. I'll come over to Williams. What day would you like to do it? And she said, well, he'd like to have a meeting with you today. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. I'll come over today. And she said, no, you're not coming here. He's coming to you. And I mean, obviously, Frank's a quadriplegic, and it takes hours for him to get ready in the morning and, to travel from the factory at Grove all the way over to Cosworth in Northampton.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not the work of a moment. So now I'm thinking, wow, I mean, Frank's coming to see, what the heck's going on? So I said to her, I said, well, what does he want to do? And she said, well, he'd just like to have a look at the factory and have a meeting with you. So, of course, I put word around the factory. So everyone started brushing their hair and tucking their shirts in and brushing the floor and tidying the place up. Frank turns up in the factory, and he has a tour around. And we go into the boardroom to have this meeting, and what I didn't really fully understand is that over the years, obviously his wheelchair has developed quite significantly in terms of its technology. And Frank has to stand up every 20 minutes to 30 minutes for circulatory reasons. And
right, okay.
In the old days, his nurse would help him out of the wheelchair into a standing frame. What I didn't realize is that things had rather moved on. So all of a sudden, Frank presses a button, and the wheelchair stands up on these hydraulic, and it's like Darth Vader, basically. It's like Darth Vader coming up from the end of your table. And I'm sitting there watching Frank Williams sort of looming over me, and he proceeds to say to me, I hear you're thinking of supplying engines to our rivals at Red Bull, and I would really prefer that you didn't do that. And it was just...
What a power move.
Yeah, anyway, that's a kind of typical moment where you're dealing with these giants, and you're not going to say to Frank Williams, I'm sorry, Frank, I'm not going to listen to what you have to say. You're going to pay attention, aren't you? Because you want to help Frank to be successful. And I look back on that as a kind of an example of a moment where you're in the presence of someone who's a real icon of the sport. The sad fact was that he was wrong to be saying what he did, because in truth, if the deal with Red Bull had happened, we were going to have quite a significant budget improvement, which would have actually enabled Cosworth to produce even better versions of the current engine. So although there was an engine freeze, when you have an engine freeze, there are still lots of things that you can do in terms of fuel and lubricants testing, and you can do lots of things in terms of exhaust system testing. And there was lots of things that we would have done. So actually, I would argue it would have been actually beneficial to Williams if we had ended up working with Red Bull. But anyway, it didn't work out in the end. It was vetoed by my dear friend Dr. Marco, and they ended up going and winning 4 championships with Renault. But that was it. When I look at young drivers now, the thing which frustrates me so much is how many of them at a very young age think they know everything about their career. They think they for example, you see so many drivers on social media who are racing in GP in Formula 3 or F2, and they think they've arrived. You haven't arrived. I mean, you're not even in the car park. You haven't arrived yet. And actually, even when you get into Formula 1, you still haven't arrived, because a lot of drivers don't stay in Formula 1 for more than 1 or 2 years. So you've really got to work hard and keep learning. And again, going back to Coops, to your question earlier on about working with drivers like Mika and Jacques and DC. So one of the things that you learn very quickly with working with DC and Mika is the inherent curiosity they have to keep on learning, and they're still doing it in their 50s. And they, as drivers, when Mika got into Formula 1 with Team Lotus, he realized the car was rubbish. So he just thought, well, I'll just do the best job I can. And so he focused on learning as much as he could about that car, that team, how to be competitive. And then he got the opportunity to go to McLaren. And from arriving in Formula 1 to winning his first Grand Prix was 7 years. I mean, he spent 7 years learning before he made his breakthrough. And then, he won 2 world championships. So you talk to Mika, and the journey was not meteoric like Jacques Villeneuve. The journey was pretty slow trajectory. Similarly with David Coulthard, he will tell you, he got to the top of Formula 1. He's driving for a McLaren Mercedes, and he wakes up one morning and realizes, I've got a teammate who's quicker than me. And we've got an arch rival who's possibly quicker than both of us. So having achieved his dream, he knows that Mika Hakkinen is probably going to out-qualify him, and therefore get the preferred race strategy, and therefore probably win more races. And by the way, DC also realized that Mika was Ron Dennis's favorite child, basically. So he was. So all drivers at all stage have to recognize their place in the world and work bloody hard to make sure that they, that they make all of that work. And I think this is, so I suppose what I'm saying in a long-winded way is that when I look at young drivers today, they really need to go out and get as much good advice as possible, have a great group of people around them helping them. That doesn't mean surrounding yourself with sycophants who tell you how amazing you are, because actually it's much better to be surrounded by people who say, you know what, you don't know everything. You got to keep on working. You got to go down the gym, work the harder. You actually need the truth being told to you. And, again, David Coulthard's very good on this topic, because his manager was Martin Brundle. And I mean, he tells some very good stories about Martin Brundle calling him up and saying, DC, don't believe your own PR. Things are not as good as you think they are. You might be in trouble. So we need to look at career opportunities and all of that. And when DC left McLaren, and he was unemployed, and he literally wrote to every Formula 1 team, begging for test drives and looking for opportunities, and ended up going to Red Bull. And what a great turn of events that was. But when you hear DC relate the story, you realize that even as a McLaren driver with 13 Grand Prix victories behind him, he didn't have a secure future, so he had to work extremely hard for it. So I think, up and down the paddock, there's always the sad stories of drivers who nearly made it and didn't. And it comes down to having that belief in yourself, but also getting the right group of people around you to help you to achieve your passion.
Well, let's talk about your career in motorsport itself. Was it the inspiration of Eddie Jordan creating his own team that made you create your own team, and which culminated in that A1GP championship that you won?
Yeah, that was a little bit of a personal thing. What had happened was Red Bull Racing had moved their commercial operations to Salzburg in Austria, and
right.
I had one of those short meetings that you have with your boss once in a while. A short meeting with Christian Horner, at which I realized my future in the team probably wasn't going to last much longer, and it was actually a very funny meeting. And I think, having worked with Eddie for such a long time, I realized the writing was slightly on the wall, so I sort of cut straight to the chase and said to Christian, shall I make other plans for the future? And he was like super relieved, he was like, yes, so. But anyway, when I left Red Bull, I realized A1GP was coming along, and I was introduced to an Irish businessman, Mark Kershaw, and Mark was really keen to get involved in racing. And it had been a little bit of a niggle of mine that I've worked on the commercial side of the sport, but I haven't worked on the operational side, and so the technical. So I'm not an engineer, and I thought this is a good opportunity. We'd go out and find a team, put a team together, and create something. And okay, it's not Formula One, but it's A1GP. It's an international series, quite big, fast cars. So that's what we did. So we started the team, and Mark put in the money, and I went out and started recruiting people. And we put an ex-Jordan driver, Ralph Furman, in the car for the first season, and so we began that journey. And what I will say is that it is unquestionably the toughest I've ever done. It taught me a lot about people, because when you own a team, you meet good people and you meet less good people, and you meet the odd sort of negative person. You come up against all kinds of challenging situations, to sit in a meeting and tell a driver that they're not going to drive the car anymore because they're not, quite frankly, they're not up to the job, is something I'd never had to do. It was the kind of thing that Eddie had to do before. And, to employ engineers and then to maybe sack an engineer, not because they're a bad person, but because the team is just not competitive. So we learned a lot. And I very often characterize those 4 years in A1GP that we spent 2 years doing pretty well everything wrong, and then we learned from that, and then we spent the next 2 years doing pretty well everything right, and then we won the championship, and then we went into GP3, and there were 46 teams applied for GP3, only 10 teams got into GP3, so we were one of the 10 that got into GP3, and again, my relationship with Bernie Ecclestone helped, and also Eddie Jordan helped me at the time. So we got into GP3. Yeah. We also did Le Mans on 4 occasions. So we ran two. We ran a GT1 Aston Martin at Le Mans. We finished 9th. We ran LMP2 cars at Le Mans, and because of setting up the team and doing all of that, I then got approached by Cosworth, and they said, you obviously, you're good on the operational side. So one thing led to another. So because I jumped into running a team, it led to the opportunity at Cosworth. So it achieved its purpose, and I learned a great deal more about racing. I also learned a great deal about myself, including what I'm good at and also what I'm not good at. And so it was a really good growth experience. And I think, that there are lots of people in there are lots of people I know in Formula One who have done exactly the same job for 40 years. Journalists, engineers, mechanics, factory staff, they've spent decades doing the same job. That was never what I wanted to do. I love the sport so much that I wanted to try as many different aspects as possible. I wanted to work on the commercial side. I wanted to work on the operational side. I wanted to, experience working with the FIA on the regulatory side. I've done that. I wanted to get involved in deals with Formula One, with Bernie. I've done that. So yes, I've ended up with quite a broad career experience, and I've really enjoyed all of it. But I just say it's taught me where my strengths are, and there's no question that my strengths lie in much more in the commercial side, sort of pulling together deals, seeing opportunities, working with people, and I love that. So that's the bit that I probably miss a little bit with what I do now. But what's different now is that although I'm not working in a team, instead of putting together a deal for a team, I'm putting together a deal for a driver. And, that's exciting because you're still working out how much the sponsor's going to pay, what the driver gets out of it, how the deal's going to work, all that kind of stuff. And I still love all of that. So it's working in the team environment definitely was something that I enjoyed doing, but setting up my team and Status Grand Prix in the end had a 10-year career. So from when we set it up in 2005 through to when Teddy Yip replaced Mark Kershaw as my fellow shareholder in the team. And then ultimately we sold ultimately Teddy sold what was by then a GP2 stroke Formula 2 team, was sold to Prima Racing. So that was the end of that sort of phase. But yeah, it was exciting, but demanding.
It sounds it, but ultimately you won that championship, and that's something you can always, with your own team. There's not many people that get that sort of experience.
A1 Team Ireland is the last international motor racing team to win a world championship with a Ferrari engine, including Scuderia Ferrari. So put that in your cap.
I'm going to get that printed on my wall.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's kind of that if I ever run into Mattia Binotto in the airport, I'm just going to go up to him and say, listen, if you need any tips, mate, I'm very happy to give you a helping hand. But it was all good fun. Those were great cars, that the 2009 car powered by that Ferrari engine. It was a very unsuitable engine for a single seater, but actually Ferrari did a good job with it, and it was a cracking car, and we really enjoyed working with it. And had some great races in A1GP. And actually, people say to me A1GP failed. It didn't fail, because what A1GP proved is that there is demand around the world for open wheel single seater racing other than Formula One. And actually, when you look at the success that Formula E has had, people are kind of surprised that Formula E has had a niche. Well, actually, I think the proof for Formula E was A1GP, because it just goes to show there are lots of cities and lots of countries around the world who would love to have an open wheel single seater motor racing, and they know they can't afford Formula One, but they could have something else. And I do still think that there's an opportunity to develop series like that in the future. I think it's something that Liberty, I do think it's a growth opportunity for Formula One in the future to have something that's closer to Formula One in terms of a second tier, perhaps even take Formula 2 and do something a little bit more meaty. I kind of feel like Formula 2 and Formula 3 are so driven downwards below Formula 1 that they're kind of pushed into the ground. And I think that, again, if you look at the history of Formula 1, Formula 2 back in the 1960s was the kind of thing that a Formula 1 driver might actually take part in. And I do think that there are lots of scopes to develop racing in the future. It just requires people to be a little bit more open-minded about what they might do with it.